Welcome to this week's edition of Steve's Sabrmetric Non-Sequiturs. Excellence for hitters in baseball tends to be measured on how well a player performs in the Triple Crown stats: batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. While these do not necessarily denote an exceptional player individually, leading the respective league in all three has occurred in such rarity that only exceptional players in Major League Baseball history have achieved it. Less elusive, though, is the Triple Crown for pitching: wins, earned run average, and strikeouts. Whereas the hitting side is largely based on individual stats, save for the luck involved in having teammates on base to drive in, the pitching crown is based on stats that are more team performance focused. Not strikeouts, but wins and ERA definitely can be overvalued depending on the team behind them. Allowing runs is primarily a defensive stat, while wins encompass the entire team's proficiency. And like batting average, all ERAs are not created equal. The first analysis I ran focused on the degree of difficulty for a closing pitcher to record a save against particular teams. I could have tried to use the same metric, but this time I felt it better to understand how a defense affected balls in play relating to base runners. I hadn't really thought of using the batting average on balls in play before, since only recently did I look at it as a percentage of hits allowed on playable balls for a defense. I started by finding the batting average on balls in play for each team. This is found by subtracting the number of home runs from hits, then subtracting strikeouts from at-bats, before adding sacrifice flies. The former is divided by the latter to find the percentage. After dividing by the league average, it creates a modifier for what each hit was allowed by a defense was worth. At the extremes, it never meant more than 8 hits per 100 plus or minus depending on the defense in question. But the Cincinnati Reds and the Colorado Rockies were the only teams that fit in this extreme. Most other teams were able to keep it between 4 per 100. To round out the team-specific modifiers, I needed to know what rate each base runner cost a defense a run. Using a similar set of values as average on balls in play, I subtracted the number of home runs from runs allowed, while also subtracting them from hits and adding walks and hit by pitches. Dividing the former by the latter allows me to have a second modifier for how defenses affect runs allowed. The first tracked an inverse of relative ranges of a defense, and the second, tied to base runners, gives an idea of general competency. It doesn't account directly for errors, but one can assume the further a defense strayed above the league average of 0.29 runs per base runner, the greater their percentage of errors. The first time I compiled something, the data set was exhaustive. This time when looking at pitchers, I only used ERA qualifiers, who had to have at least 1 inning pitched per team game played, 162 innings. While a rubber-armed reliever could qualify, this is mainly the arena of starting pitchers, the top 25 to be exact. I didn't essentially need ERA, since it projects how many non-error caused runs are given up in a complete game start, so instead I focused on runs per inning. I first needed to know the value of a pitcher to defense on balls in play. So aside from the hits in play, I needed an aggregate number of innings where only in-play outs were recorded. I took the strikeouts for each pitcher and divided it by 3 to find the total number of aggregate innings pitched without a ball entering play. By subtracting this from the total innings pitched, we have an idea of what each pitcher's runs per inning ratio is on balls in play. Generally, every player had a higher ratio of in-play earned runs to standard earned runs per inning, with the league average for the differential at 0.021 runs saved by pitcher performance. The pitchers on the high end were Anibal Sanchez, Matt Harvey, Felix Hernandez, Max Scherzer, and Matt Latos. The pitchers on the low end of the top 25 ended up being Hisashi Iwakuma, Irvin Santana, Bartolo Colon, Julio Teheran, and Travis Wood. I could have stopped here, but that would have made the team modifiers worthless. The other reason I wanted to have hits on balls in play for each pitcher was so that I could have an idea of how many runs a defense would project to allow based on the number of base runners allowed on base. I took hits in play allowed and divided it by the modifier for defensive range, giving an adjusted number of hits allowed. I then added walks and hit by pitches to have an aggregate amount of adjusted base runners for each pitcher. I then multiplied it by the average runs per base runner ratio for each pitcher's team, which gave me the projected runs allowed by a pitcher adjusted for the defense behind him. That is, after adding home runs back into the equation. I subtracted both runs allowed and earned runs allowed separately from the result before dividing each differential by innings pitched. This gave me a competency rating for how many runs a pitcher saved the defense per inning. In terms of total runs allowed, every pitcher was above the threshold as a supplement to their defense, except for two pitchers, Mike Minor and Max Scherzer. That's right, the 2013 American League Cy Young Award winner didn't do his defense any favors. It was barely noticeable, but he did have a negative adjusted differential for runs allowed. When adjusting it for the performance of each defense through earned runs, every pitcher had a positive differential. When looking at the differential per inning, it gets kind of interesting. Three pitchers from the bottom five of the initial in-play earned runs per inning were at the top of my list: Bartolo Colon, Hisashi Iwakuma, and Travis Wood. Jose Fernandez and Shelby Miller also made appearances. This somewhat contradicts the first analysis with the assumption that those pitchers were playing in a much better defense. But it could be a sign that the current understanding of measuring runs allowed in any league may need to err on the side of understanding the total context of runs prevented. While it is more of a ratio like batting average for a hitter, ERA seems to be much more team-related stat. While it is more of a ratio like batting average for a hitter, ERA seems to be much more of a team-related stat like RBIs. This may be why there is an outlier with Hernandez and Iwakuma being on such wide ends of the first spectrum while being on the same team. But one may have just better luck than the other. Either way, it's always fun to provide context to such renowned statistics. Check out the Ashwarmers podcast on YouTube.com. Follow me on Twitter at @SteveCasper. This might be my last non sequitur for a while, so stay tuned for football functions next time.